I am really thrilled to introduce two sessions to you today. The first by VITTORIA, ECCLESIA, and FABRIZIO NASTARI. They're going to be doing a presentation that they've lovingly titled New Music and Old Instruments. So I'm going to get out of the way and turn the presentation over to them. Please keep your cameras off and your mics muted for the presentation, and we will have about 5 minutes for questions before the half hour.
Okay, thank you, Jessica. Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. This presentation intends to show two perspectives of the composition process behind Elogio dell'errore, a piece for one player with a modern and a period clarinet. We will show and discuss the different stages of this collaboration between me, the composer, and Vittoria, the performer. Very short introduction about us. I am an Italian composer and doctoral student at the Estonian Academy of Music and Theatre. I am actually researching how to use irony in the composition practice. So how to elaborate new musical material through ironic devices. I start usually by taking into consideration three elements: the ironist, the object, and the sociocultural context. So for instance, for this composition that we are going to present here, the elements are the ironist, meaning myself, and my reflections on the object. The sociocultural context is the situation of the premiere. So in this case, the concert took place during a week in which we were discussing artistic researchers issues with colleagues from other European institutions. And the object is what I want to investigate through ironic lens. So in this case, Vittoria's background and interest, and I will talk especially about this last aspect, the object. Vittoria. Oops.
Hi, I am so sorry. My computer just turned off in front of me, but hopefully this will not happen again. And I was the one in charge of sharing my screen, so I will do it now and then let Fabrizio introduce us properly. Sorry, Jessica, since I re-entered, I need to be given the permission to share the screen again.
Try now, it should be good.
Yes, it is. Thank you so much. So here we go. I will let Fabrizio start. And
yeah, I just introduced myself, so maybe you can.
Okay, perfect. Then you know Fabrizio already. I'm Vittoria. I'm a clarinetist and I am a doctoral student also at the Estonian Academy of Music, like Fabrizio. There is where we met. And the topic of my doctoral research is basically the differences between a modern clarinet and a 13-keyed Müller-system period clarinet from the perspective of the performer. So to do this sort of comparison, I have theoretical support in the concept of affordance, which is a concept borrowed from the field of ecological psychology. So in simple words, affordances are the possibility of action offered by an object to an individual. So they depend on the object, but also on the individual interacting with this object. So when we apply this concept to classical music and musical instrument, it means that we get affordances from our musical instruments. So I explore these affordances that the period clarinet and modern clarinet give me, offer me, and I compare those affordances. And the main claim of my doctoral thesis is that this interaction with affordances of period clarinet can help develop skills also on modern clarinet, so that these affordances can become sort of transferable and help us develop our musicianship. So as a part of my research, I decided to commission a piece to Fabrizio titled Elogio dell'errore. This title roughly means praise to the mistake, and soon you will see why we wanted to praise the mistake. So one of the main reasons for commissioning the piece was, first of all, to show this artistic potential that I saw in historical instruments that, in my opinion, historical instrument could still have in the modern context. So highlight the positive qualities of the instrument, what I found were its affordances, and so have new repertoire specifically for period clarinets and hopefully spark the interest in other composers or other performers. And other reasons that were tied more closely to my main research topic were that normally I do the comparison of the instruments in my practice room in a very strict practice setting, not a performance one, but I wanted to create an occasion to have the comparison also in the sort of very different emotionally setting of a performance. And additionally, this comparison had I sort of had the idea of reimagining the concept of what we consider a mistake, what we consider wrong in music, because yeah, what we consider wrong or good in musical context is very culturally and chronologically also situated. So I basically wanted to explore how we consider things right or wrong when playing. And I discussed these topics with Fabrizio because I just wanted to have also his take about these ideas in his composition.
Yeah, the concept of the mistake was really interesting to me as well, and I tried to develop it with my own tools. But I had also other motivations, more personal, and I wanted to experiment with theatrical features, to experiment with the composition process, and I wanted the challenge of a new instrument because this is the first time I write for a period instrument. Experiment with the composition process means that the object is Vittoria's background, as I told you, but usually the object is something related to my personal interest or my background. So this element was new for me this time to work with. So in particular, what I found inspirational in Vittoria's background was her musical career, because she started in a marching band and I developed these in theatrical gestures. Also, she plays the modern and period clarinet. So this information I used to develop theatrical gestures too, but also the comparison between the two instruments is combined with the theory of affordances. So I developed the concept of the mistake in thinking about affordances. And so the collaboration started also from these points, not only the musical or technical ones that are usually the points a composer and the performer discuss, even though we discussed, of course, technical issues. And Vittoria can say something about this.
Yes. Basically, when we first met to discuss this piece, I knew that I wanted to give Fabrizio information about what I thought were interesting affordances of period clarinet and in general what I thought was interesting exploring. But I also didn't want to give him sort of instructions or be too strict in what I was telling him. So my purpose was to show him an array of possibilities to answer any questions he had and clear his doubts about the instrument, but without really advancing hard requests on what I wanted to have in the piece. So give some input, but then just leave space for his interpretation of my research and my ideas and his compositional creativity. So I showed him what, in my opinion, were interesting differences between the instruments. I played him musical excerpts on both clarinets so that he could actually hear the differences in action in real life. Also, I showed him passages or notes that don't sound so good to modern ears, with the perspective of either avoiding them if he felt like, or to incorporate them in an ironic way in the piece, playing with this concept of mistake and what is right and what is wrong. We also tested some extended technique on period clarinet, and we discussed some issues of timing for switching the instrument to incorporate it in the sort of theatrical part of the performance.
Firstly, I started to collect musical material, so I decided to use many seventh chords and chromatism to give an appearance or a false impression of the 19th century sound environment. Chromaticism in particular was the feature that Müller wanted to improve. But also I was intrigued by the multiphonic on the period instrument, which is something that probably Müller was not thinking about. And symbolically, I used the multiphonic to link him to us. So we can hear now maybe this passage that is also the end of the piece.
Yes, I am going to show you. Oh, sorry. Here we go.
No, the video is not.
Why? Why is technology failing me today? I am so sorry. We literally tried this earlier. Do you hear anything?
No, we don't see the video.
Oh. Okay. Okay, I'm sorry, I will play it again.
Thank you. So this was with the period clarinet. The use of the two clarinets was actually the starting point of our collaboration and how to use them. We wanted to find an artistic way to compare the two instruments. And so talking about affordances, I approached the concept of the mistake as an artistic possibility. Having both instruments in the piece gave me the idea to think about theatrical actions, but how to make the change of the instrument part of the piece. And so here comes the importance of collaboration. I thought that could be interesting to have Vittoria marching on a stage. So because she was in a marching band, so this was the connection. And so now I have two theatrical actions in my pocket, the change of the instrument and the marching action. So the changing of the instrument is not more isolated. And in order to render the marching more efficient and part of the composition, I requested Vittoria to put a tambourine on one of her feet. Luckily, she agreed. And now the marching action works on two levels. The marching, so the active one, which creates surprise and expectations on the stage, and also a rhythmical line in dialogue with the clarinet. The tambourine works as a second line, but it becomes also an embellishment that we use to cover the mistake, so there is an artistic output. We will show some examples very soon, but it is important also to say that I composed without defining everything, because we needed to rehearse the marching, the movements, how to cover the stage, how to walk, how to change the instrument. So we discussed a lot, and the rehearsing moment was really important and part of the composition process.
Yes, there was a lot of exchange and discussion going on to actually get to a sort of at least partially final version of the piece, because when I got the first draft from Fabrizio, I had a few days to practice and start to understand how to work with the clarinet and the feet part. And then we met to define all these aspects that he mentioned. So this first aspect to perfect were related to the theatrical part of stepping. We discussed what kind of steps we wanted to do in different moments according to also what was going on with the music, so that they matched, the character of the steps matched the music sort of. We even tried what kind of concert shoes would work best with both the sound of stepping and the tambourine. You can see in the picture, we had two different kinds of tambourine that we tried out, and we agreed for the one on the left because it had a stronger elastic and it allowed me to move more around without risking of losing a tambourine around the stage. And also we decided to define together exactly how this covering up of mistakes with the tambourine would work. You can see the score, how it is noted, the tambourine and the actual music. And hoping it will work, I will show you briefly how it played out in the actual performance. So here we are, and so you see that basically the concept was that whenever there was a passage that would not come out so smoothly on period clarinet, we would fakely cover it up with the tambourine, so that this sort of mistake became a gesture part of the music. So is it a mistake anymore? This was basically what was behind this reasoning. Another aspect that we had to define was the balance of dynamic between the clarinet and the feet, which was something that I had to work on. It was not Fabrizio's responsibility, but it was mine to agree on what that would be and then work on my limb independence, basically. And finally, we work on the exact timing of the various theatrical gestures, in particular, the moment where I would run off stage to change the clarinets and then come back. I will also show you that. Yeah, sorry, I exited too early, but you can hear that I kept smashing the tambourine while I was off stage to not break the sort of tension, so that the audience would not think that it was over, but they would understand that there was still something going on while I was hidden. And while I was smashing the tambourine, I was actually switching to period clarinets and then coming back with a different type of walk. So the videos that we showed you were from the premiere, the sort of pre-premiere of the piece, but we still have some work to do after having had this performance, because some issues came up through performing the piece in public in real life. Fabrizio, you are muted. Yeah.
Yes, we want to elaborate the final version now in a way that everything can be clear also for other players. We noticed that the acoustic is very important, since the tambourine is very incisive and punchy. So we want to write the dynamics of the tambourine and work on the timbrical aspects of the two clarinets in order to enhance their features. But we want to leave the score open to interpretation. We want the performer to be free to decide how to interact with the acoustic and the stage. About this also, we want to suggest a path of the performer on the stage But for instance, the running needs to be prepared. The distances to cover too need a preparation. So the score should remain open since the stage is always different. We want to suggest also to learn the piece by heart, because this should give to the performer more self-awareness and control. If the performer can walk and move freely without looking for the stand that is waiting for the performer, everything is smoother and also theatrically more efficient, I think. So this will be one of that piece more than others in which the score is a list of instructions and indications open to interpretations, I think.
Yes, so when we will finish working on these improvements, we have already a performance lined up in the spring of 2023, where I will learn the music by heart and where we will integrate these tiny tweaks and improvements in the part. So there is work for both of us, for Fabrizio to improve the markings, it's mostly about marking stuff and making the score clearer, and for me to learn by heart and improve the theatrical part. And our sort of conclusions about this collaboration are that, well, first of all, it was successful for us, it was very fruitful, and a really important aspect for this was that we both had a very strong commitment, because in this case it was part of our research, and it was really important. Like, we both had very sort of clear goals in why he wanted to compose this and why I wanted to perform this and what was to come out of this. And another important aspect that we want to remind composers and performers to have when interacting is the sort of being open and have this double-ended trust. On the part of the composer, they should trust when we put a boundary that something is not playable, that something is out of the world of practice. But on the side of the performer, we should also be open to push our boundaries and try to achieve what the composers are demanding of us. And of course, this is a common sense interaction between performers and composers, but in our experience, we don't see it always actualized. So it's good to remind that both parts should be open and trust each other's expertise. And on my part, showing how the instrument works, I think that the decision to just give him an array of possibilities without making hard demands was the right choice, at least for this specific project. Of course, the risk in this type of interaction is that the projects are so closely tied up with our own goals that then the piece will get very limited performances only in this very specific framework. But of course, this sort of issue falls in the general issue of the amount of performances that contemporary music actually gets. And of course, this sort of collaboration is very time consuming, so it cannot be done for every single new music piece that we want to have out. But in this project, it was really worth it. And of course, if any of you now is interested in the piece and wants to ask for the score, the problem of limited performances will be maybe overcome. So if you feel so, please feel free to contact us at our email addresses down here. And now we will be happy to keep chatting with you and answering to any questions you might have.
Thank you so much. What a cool piece. Really.
Thank you.
I actually had a question. So for those that aren't familiar with the differences between the keyed the period instrument and the regular clarinets that most of us have, can you kind of talk about some of those challenges that you mentioned, where you're talking about a mistake, and realistically what's written there can be played on a modern instrument, but on the period clarinet, it's not possible. And so I think for people who aren't familiar with period instruments, they may not know why it's not possible.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for the question. So in my research, I use the Müller instrument because it's the one that is the closest to the modern clarinet. So because of a whole other part of the research that is not relevant at the moment. So what is missing, it has 13 keys. So basically what is mostly missing is the possibility in the lower in the lower part to have the exchanges between the keys. You know how we have 4 keys for each side, because then if you can't take a note on one side, you can on the other. So on Müller clarinet, you can't, you just you have 2 keys on one side, 2 keys on the other, and that's it. So most of the mistakes that we were covering up were me shifting from one key to another with the same pinky. This was the most part. So it is playable on the Müller clarinet. It's just that it will come out slightly strange, especially because it was written in like nice legato to enhance this sort of issue of shifting between the keys. Another main difference is that there are a couple notes that are that you play in the same positions as on German clarinet. So this was also something that I had to get used to, but this was more of a personal practice issue, not particularly something that would sound out as a mistake.
Oops. Fabrizio, for you, have you written many pieces for clarinet? I know this writing for a Müller clarinet is much different than writing for a modern instrument. Do you have other works in your catalog that are just for regular clarinet that people could check out?
Only in ensemble context, so not for solo clarinet. So this is also a challenge. Yes. Yeah, only in ensemble context with a bass clarinet, also contrabass clarinet once. And yeah, for me, it was really interesting, this mistake concept, because it is fun to have the passage that is a mistake, but then it can become something musically valuable and interesting. And yeah, so it was fun to listen to Vittoria play the period clarinet and try to imagine how to use.
Does anyone else in the chat have any questions for Vittoria and Fabrizio before we switch over to our next sessions? Please feel free to turn your mic on or type it in the chat. Okay, well, they provided their information there. So if you think of something later, feel free to look back on the presentation, and we'll also be sharing their contact information on the website so that you can reach out to them if you have interest in the piece or in their work. But I appreciate you both so much for sharing this. I'm looking forward to hearing more and looking at the full recording of the piece
Thank you so
later
much.
on.
Yeah, we will be sharing the full recording if anyone is interested. And yeah, thank you so much for having us and listening to us. And I'm sorry for my technical issues, but yeah,
no,
that's 2022.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
All right, next, I would love to welcome Ronnie Moore. Ronnie's going to be speaking a little bit about a piece that she's worked on.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. Hello, everyone.
Let me get you pinned here.
What's that?
I said, let me get you pinned real quick.
Okay, great. Tell me when you're ready.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm super happy to see everyone here today, and hello to everyone in the future watching this on the recording. Thank you to Vittoria and Fabrizio for that really fascinating presentation. I can't wait to hear the whole piece too. Thank you so much to the ICA for having me, and Stephanie and Jessica, who've been super awesome in putting together this really wonderful event. My name is Ronnie Moore, and I'm coming to you from Boston, Massachusetts today. So let me start my slideshow. All right. So you can see this sort of cheeky title of my presentation here, Launching Solo Clarinet Performance into Outer Orbit, and then a short description. of a meaningful collaboration I did a few years ago using Matthew Shoemaker's Streamlines after Robert Lawrence for solo clarinet and electronics about the first Black astronaut to explore a collaborative revision process for better playability. So here's what I'll talk about today. I'll introduce the piece. I'll make some points about clarinet register shifts as they relate to this piece. We'll have a brief discussion about multiphonics as they relate to the topic. I'll talk about other relevant technical topics related to revision, a general roadmap for success, and play a short excerpt from Streamlines. If you have your clarinets handy, I'll put a few examples up for everyone to try in real time, but totally okay just to listen and watch. I would say this talk is geared for those kind of starting out in new music, but should be fun for everyone, I hope. If you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat as we go. And as you know, we'll leave a couple of minutes at the end to answer that. A real brief bit about myself for some context, because I think it's really helpful, especially for younger people, to see what a career in new music looks like. So I teach at the Boston Conservatory at Berklee in the Contemporary Music Department, which offers a master's degree that emulates what it's like to be in a professional ensemble. I also teach at the Longia School of Music in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which aims to train musicians that make a difference in the world. So you can imagine we get a lot of interesting players on a non-standard path there at Longia. So I am a new music sort of specialist, although that's not everything I do. I play regularly with orchestras in town, like the Boston Ballet, principal clarinet of the Boston Philharmonic. I'm a founding member of the Thalia Ensemble, New York-based group, which was one of the first groups in the US in recent history to really focus on the European avant-garde. I have a wind quintet, the Seed of Tomorrow, which specializes in new music. And I run a concert series in Boston called Windsor Music that does a lot of commissioning. As a guest, I've played with most of the new music groups in New York and Boston and a few elsewhere. And I stopped counting, but like a lot of you, I've played a lot of premieres, and I think it's well over 1,000 by now. So I say all this to just emphasize the point that I've worked with a lot of composers over the years. So I met Matthew Shoemaker after working with his composition class at MIT, where he at the time was a visiting MLK scholar. He showed me his solo clarinet piece, Streamlines, that he had written a year earlier. And the clarinetist that gave the premiere did a wonderful job, but he felt like the piece didn't quite sound like the way he had imagined it, and asked if I would take a look and offer suggestions. So let me just say, Matt's a stellar person and really open. So this was a super cool opportunity. The piece is an homage to the pilot Robert Lawrence, who was the first African-American to be selected for a space program. Lawrence studied a difficult aircraft maneuver, a steep descent gliding technique called the flare maneuver. And his work contributed significantly to the development of the space shuttle. Tragically, Lawrence never made it to space as he died in a training accident. His name fell into obscurity for a while until 1997, 30 years after he died. His name was engraved in the Space Mirror at the Kennedy Center, which honors astronauts who made the ultimate sacrifice for the space program. So the visual inspiration for the piece is Robert Lawrence flying in the sky, conducting his research. And the harmony for the piece is directly drawn from audio recordings of an actual F-104 starfighter plane. So that's a fun visual of that. And Matthew used a computer program to create musical lines in the clarinet part from the photograph contours of curved aerodynamic streamlines flowing off a plane's wing. All super cool stuff. So with this background, I understood that this piece is about lithe, free-flowing, smooth lines, and that was the main thing he didn't feel like was coming across in the music. I looked at the piece, and actually it needed very little changing to accomplish that. Here's an excerpt of the piece, and you can try it if you want. You can see it's not too fast, quarter equals 100, but it's kind of tricky. Why is it tricky? Well, there are a few large leaps which can be tricky because they often involve many fingers moving at the same time and a shift in the amount of pressure. But I think really the most tricky thing is the registral shifts. So you've all learned about the registers of the clarinet, right? Each register above the lowest shallow register is an overtone of the shallow, right? Just to demonstrate, we can do an exercise that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. You can play with me if you want. You take a low C and overblow to the next available notes in the overtone series. Change it without changing the fingering. So if you're having trouble finding or achieving those partials without changing your fingers, don't worry. It's a whole nother conversation, and you can have that with your teacher or you can email me. But it's a great exercise for flexibility and control, by the way. But back to the topic at hand. So between these registers, there's a break created, right? Because we're switching partials akin to switching partials like a brass player. There's the infamous break, you know, between the B flat and the B. There's a break between the high clarion C and this altissimo C sharp. And depending upon what altissimo fingerings you're using, there are other breaks in the altissimo. If you're using quote unquote normal fingerings, it's between the F sharp and the G altissimo. And each of these registers require different voicings. So going over breaks once is totally fine. Of course, we've all practiced many hundreds of hours, right, to smoothing these things out. But here we're talking about idiomatic writing. What is the instrument designed to do well? And if you're a composer going for smooth, silky lines, you want to avoid constant back and forth, right? So here's the original. It looks kind of colorful now, and the revised part. You can see in the first example that, like in the first measure here, that almost every note is in a different partial, right? And it's technically playable, right? It's actually a great etude, but not idiomatic. So in the second example, we've changed a few notes to keep things in the same partial for longer, and that makes it so much easier. By the way, beat 4 of the first measure there, if you just play that D as an open or fake fingering, you'll keep the D in the clarion register, which results in the same partial for that whole long stint. So I went through the piece bar by bar and suggested them some things here and there. And Matt had the ultimate last say, and once he understood the rules, he made his own changes too. This process and just small changes left the piece so much more playable and approachable. So another thing that comes up all the time, I find in new pieces that can be sort of problematics are multiphonics, and multiphonics specifically not working as they are notated. I'll get to that in a second. Here's the opening multiphonic of Streamlines. You can try it yourself and see if it works for you. It's quite an easy one to get out. But for me, at least, those aren't the notated notes. Matt got this from some sort of book somewhere. What comes out for me is E flat on the bottom, G quarter flat in the middle, and C quarter sharp on the top. And why is this such a problem? I see all the time. Well, that's a big topic, but basically the books that have been recommended for many years contain lots of fingerings that don't work as notated for most people playing instruments and setups that are popular today. So I'm not going to write down the names of those books since I don't want anyone to recommend them to composers. Instead, I have some resources for you. We have Heather Roche's blog, which is awesome. She has a lot of different topics, in not just multiphonics. Greg Oakes has a great website. Harry Sparney's book is excellent for bass clarinet. And I don't own Sarah Watt's book, but a lot of people I trust recommend that book as well. And I'd also suggest keeping a personal journal of multiphonics that work for you. Every time you encounter a multiphonic that you think is great, just jot it down for future use. So I have a few suggestions in working with altering existing multiphonics that don't work. And they all start with asking the composer what they want. Do you want a multiphonic with the same complexity as you've notated? So there's a real difference. These are just two random examples between this dyad, you can try it yourself, and this buzzing, complicated one, right? When I talked to Matt Shoemaker about his first multiphonic in his piece, the exactness of the pitches wasn't super important to him. So the timbre or complexity and the dynamic were the most important thing. So we just kept it as is. Speaking of dynamics, if the dynamic is the most important thing for the composer, that gives you a lot of license. I found a lot of time composers just want something super loud and raucous. In that case, you can just do a split tone, which is kind of like the partial exercise we were just doing, except you play multiple partials that interfere with each other at the same time. That's kind of a fun sound to do. And again, if you don't know how to do that, just ask your teacher or email me. Another thing to consider, you could ask them, what's important to you, consonants versus dissonance? The composer may just want a beautiful consonant interval and the notes may not be important, or they might want a dissonant interval like this. There also may be a specific note that's super important to their harmonic or melodic concept. And actually a nice trick, if you want to keep the same top note, but they don't care about anything else, you can just play that top note and bring out an undertone by just using slow air and a somewhat looser embouchure. You can try it on any clarion or altissimo note. I'll try it on an A. It's a nice delicate sound and you get that nice A there. Another trick, if they just want the bottom note, is to play the split tone again based on that bottom tone. So enough about multiphonics. I could talk about that all day long and I love talking about it, but let's talk about some other things. Other things that didn't specifically come up in streamlines, but do come up very frequently, I found, when encountering new works, are trills and tremolos that don't work. So one solution, and this might be really obvious, but you can suggest just changing octave of one or both notes. Another thing is fast microtones, especially if you're playing music by spectralist composers. I say just looking at the harmony and see which notes are really important to the harmony. Sometimes if you just change one note in an impossible run, it can make it playable, kind of like we were doing with streamlines. Fast tonguing, especially fast slap tonguing. There's so many scenarios here. It's hard to just summarize a solution, but you know, if a composer is looking for a driving rhythm, for example, you might add some accents along with some slurs, or just take out a note here and there without disturbing the flow. Breathing. Composers are almost always sympathetic to our human need for air. So if you just tell them you need a breath, it should be fine. This is one that comes up a bunch. Unrealistic expectations of dynamics for key clicks or airy sounds. As far as key clicks go, to make them louder, you might add a different percussive sound, like a slap tongue, or like a consonant into the instrument, like flute players do, something like that. You can also add air to your key clicks to make them louder. And as far as airy sounds go, we're not flute players, right? Who can achieve like such a wonderful shakuhachi kind of sound. For us, it only really works at a very soft dynamic. But here's a tip. If the composer can give you a little bit of time, a rest before and after the airy sound, you can move your reed over to the side about 1 millimeter, and then voila, an instant 4th grade sound. Just kidding. An airy sound can be like heartbreakingly beautiful if used well. So I think with all of your creative minds out there, you'll have myriad solutions, and this can be a really fun process. I was thinking about this, and most of us are trained in the romantic framework that the score is gospel, right? But if the composer is around, it can be such a different story. You just know that the Stadlers were giving feedback and took liberties with Mozart and Mendelssohn, or I'm sure that Müller gave suggestions to Brahms too. That being said, you will encounter composers that don't want feedback, and that's okay too. You want to have the best performance, but also sort of maintain your reputation as someone who's easy to work with. It's a balance. So when working with a composer on a piece, here's a basic summary of what I've been talking to you about. I hope it's not too pedantic, and instead it's very inspiring to you. So first, make a real honest attempt to do what's written. You don't want to be that person who said the Tchaikovsky violin concerto was unplayable, because sometimes super challenging pieces can stretch you as a player. If, after all your efforts, a solution is needed, ask the composer if they would be open to switching things around, what the intent of the passage is, and that's really important. If you're really earnest, they will most likely return your generosity, as you've heard from Fabrizio earlier. And then with that in mind, come up with several alternative solutions. And finally, and this is a great way to live your life, approach with curiosity and goodwill. So hopefully that gives you a few things to think about. I will now share my screen and play you a portion of Streamlines. Matt and I put this recording together in the spring of 2020. I recorded the solo part at home, and Matt added the processing after the fact. All the electronics that you hear are my process sound and no tape. And you might notice that my video technique at that point had not quite developed. The video is mostly of my face and not of the gorgeous clarinet. Also, my plant plays a really major role in the performance, but I think the sound is excellent. So I will play a 3-minute excerpt of the 10-minute piece. So like I said, it's a 10-minute piece. Go check out Matt Shoemaker's music and play his piece. If you have questions about anything I talked about or would like to chat about Boston Conservatory or Longy, you can contact me through my website. I'll just put it in the chat, ronniemoore.com. And I see Jessica has put Matt's website also in the chat. One thing I wanted to mention is you can get ahead of all of this by making your own style guide. I don't know if any of you have heard about that. It's basically just a document that lists everything you do on your instrument. And I know of a couple of ensembles that have really great ones. I don't personally have one myself. Alarm Well Sound has a great one, and Load Bang, that's another ensemble. They have great style guides as far as they relate to clarinet and bass clarinet, so you might want to check that out. So thank you everyone for listening, and let me know if you have any questions about anything.
Thank you so much, Ronnie. That's such a, again, just really cool pieces from both presenters. And I think a lot of people feel intimidated by working with a composer specifically for the first time. So, and I know you've had a lot of experience doing that. So can you kind of speak maybe to anyone who's here today or watching at a later time that is thinking of commissioning someone, but is worried about approaching the composer about changes or suggestions on compositional techniques as a first-time commissioner, what that might look like? That's just something that I thought might be helpful.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think sort of the general guidelines I gave you, I think would do you well in any situation, really. And I think that especially if you're paying for the piece, it's sort of like the composer will view it as a collaborative process. I think it might be a little bit different if you're maybe commissioning Philip Glass or something like that. Although, you know, if Philip Glass wrote me a piece and it was impossible, I would let him know for sure. I wouldn't be intimidated or scared. You both are artists, and just approach it with mutual respect, and some beautiful things will come out of it, I'm sure.
And I think some of the people in the chat are curious if you would be able to share your PowerPoint with us so that we can put that alongside your presentation.
Absolutely, yeah.
So just email, if you can email that to me, I'll add it to the presentation page.
Absolutely.
And we have a question here from Natalie. I'm a younger clarinetist, and I was wondering why you decided to specialize or sort of focus on new music rather than pursue purely classical music, and how fulfilling do you find it?
Yeah, how did I decide? I think I got there are a lot more resources out there today. So when I was a young clarinetist, I didn't really know about new music, but as when I was in college, composers just sort of came up to me and they're like, "Would you play my piece?" And the more I did that, I was like, I really enjoy this. You know, I love being in this situation where I have a say in things. There's a piece I played a lot called Sideshow by Steve Takasugi, which I played with the Talia Ensemble a lot. We toured it around the world. And we were the first people to play it, and we made a video of it. It's an evening length, just sort of multimedia thing. And now other younger ensembles are playing it. And when I watch them play that piece, I say, oh, I can see myself in that. And that is just so cool. It's really fulfilling to be a part of this legacy process. It's also just really fascinating. I've always been a really curious person, and even like TV shows, I didn't like rewatching TV shows or movies. I always liked the newest thing. And that's kind of how I felt with music. Although, I do, like I mentioned, I do like doing it all. And I think it's really nice to be able to do it all as well. And in this just sort of landscape of being a musician, it really helps you to be able to plug yourself into all these different kinds of scenes. Yeah, but thank you for the question.
I think a lot of people would agree that working on multiphonics can really greatly help your partial transitions just in regular playing. So that's something that you should certainly consider looking at. I have another question here. I think if I can phrase this, where did you come up with to studying microtonal music?
I was first introduced to it through playing like French spectralist composers, like Grisey or Tristan Murail, and I was like, oh no, how do you do this? Because it's a whole set of new fingerings, unless you happen to have a microtonal clarinet, and that's a whole different thing. But, you know, you just, to practice it, you practice your microtones like you would practice your other scales. You practice a microtonal, or I would say start with quarter tones, which are the notes in between, halfway in between the half steps. And you can practice a chromatic scale. Whoops, my reed's to the side for the airy tone. Etc., etc. Not only chromatic scales, but you can practice like a C quarter sharp major scale. And that will be so excellent for your technique, because the quarter tones require really complicated fingerings. So when you go back to your sort of normal fingerings, it will be so smooth. Also, it really helps with your intonation. I feel like that's something when I play in orchestra, actually, that people comment a lot on, that my intonation is very good. And I think that has to do with playing all this microtonal music. I've also played, Anno Pape's concerto, which also has eighth tones in it. And there are also, all sorts of microtonal music where you play the spectrum of the fundamental note, and that those aren't necessarily eighth tones or quarter tones. They're diffuse sense, sharp or flat, or sixth tones. So there's a really cool, deep world to explore, and I would highly recommend it for your playing and just for your own discovery.